Hello, everybody. Um, I'll kind of wait a few minutes, give people a chance to get on, give a few minutes, and then we'll get started. Maybe at least 60 seconds. I'm going to say for many people in this group already familiar with me. My name is Charles Gies. I am not a psychologist. I don't have any qualifications like that. I'm an adult on the autism spectrum. And what I am going to share is my experiences, particularly growing up, and how they might be able to help a little bit in understanding what's going on inside your child's head. I think everybody in this group knows, whether you're on the spectrum or you're a parent of someone on the spectrum or even a grandparent, you know, uh, people with autism follow a different logic than most people. And the thing about us too is that many of us tend to assume that everybody else thinks the same way we do. Well, see, that can be a problem because you have two people that their way of thinking is different, but usually most people understand that about each other. But you're dealing with a child who assumes that you're following his logic and assumes that you know what he knows, and that's all you know. And illustrate just the problem of trying to understand how your child thinks. During her last years of her life, now my mom passed away about 5.5 years ago now at the age of, no, 6.5 years ago, excuse me, at the age of 98. And during her last years, she and I talked a lot about my childhood. We got closer than we'd ever been since I was a little boy. And, I came to understand a lot of things about her that I didn't know, and she came to understand me a lot better. Well, at one point I asked her about the issue when I was growing up that had caused her to take me to a child psychiatrist, that had moved her to do that. The issue was that I was in first grade, and I occasionally would have toilet accidents in school. I would wet or dirty my pants in school. And I asked Mom anyway, we were talking in her last years, I asked her if she understood why that happened. She said she thought it was because of a remark she had made about hating public restrooms. That had nothing to do with it. In fact, not only did it have nothing to do with it, but I couldn't even remember Mom ever making that remark. I mean, I understand why a lot of women feel that way about public restrooms, but I couldn't remember Mom ever saying that in front of me. But I explained the real reason. It was that, to me, I had this idea the only time it was okay to use the school restrooms was when there was a class bathroom break, and it wasn't okay to use the school restroom at any other time. So if I had to go and there was no school bathroom break or anything, I couldn't wait, I would just go in my pants. Well, that was something I got over that summer. So after first grade, it was no longer a problem. But I use that not so much to illustrate the matter of problems with the toilet accidents in school, so much as to illustrate the difference in the way of thinking between people on the autism spectrum and people who are not. Because even having known me by that time more than 60 years, Mom still hadn't figured out what the real problem had been back when I was 6 years old. Well, now something comes up. Sometimes your child, let's say he makes a remark, oh, that person's ugly, or that person's fat, that woman's fat. Wow. Well, I remember my mom telling me not to make personal remarks about people. She had to tell me that several times. And I never really got it. Finally, I just don't say anything about anybody, but it would have been more effective if she had been specific. You said this, and that's insulting. You shouldn't say things like that about people. Illustrate too, the way that we will read a direction, a rule, and the way other people will. I remember one time when I was 13, I was in a movie theater. Well, back then, movie theaters, a lot of them had soda pop vending machines, things like that. Now the food sales in movie theaters have become pretty standard, but back then, anyway, this movie theater had a soda pop vending machine, and they had a sign on the machine that said, "Please do not take drinks to the seats." So I got my drink, and I thought it was okay to take it back into the theater, but to stand in the aisle and consume it. That way, in my mind, I wasn't taking it to the seats. And the usher came up to me, and she was like, "What's the matter with you? Can't you read?" And she must have thought I was being smart alecky when I protested, but the sign said "to the seats." But again, that illustrates the difference between the way we think and the way a lot of other people will interpret things they see. Well, now, one other incident from first grade. This one, mom knew what was the problem, but the teacher didn't. Teacher put a number of sentences up on Blackboard for us to read, and I wouldn't read the sentence. Sentences all began with the word hello. I wouldn't read them, and teacher didn't understand why, because she knew I could read. Well, this sounds wacky to most people, but the word hello has a profanity embedded in it, and I wouldn't say the word hello because of that. So I wouldn't read those sentences. And when teacher talked to mom about it, mom explained it to her. The way we react to the unexpected, when things don't go the way we expect them to be, that's something, and something, again, I think what you have to do is, you understand, first of all, what your child's problem was with the situation, and okay, this is how you reacted. What other way do you think you could have reacted to it? What would have been better instead of the way you did? Well, what happened was I was in 5th grade, and class was putting on a Columbus Day play. Okay, and anyway, the boy who was supposed to speak before me messed up his lines, and so I didn't know what to say next. So I just started crying on stage. That was my reaction when he said the wrong line at the wrong time. The reaction I got from everybody, from teacher, my dad, and so on, is, and other kids, is, come on now, no need to cry. People mess up their lines all the time, but not understanding what the problem was. It's instead, you have to sit down and, okay, I understand. Did I lose something? Just a minute. Okay, hold it. I think I just lost something here. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, but then you understand the problem. Okay, how could you have handled this differently? How do you think you should handle this if this happens again? Like, just say the line you were supposed to say, even if the kid in front of you said the wrong line. And I remember one teacher that especially, I had difficulty understanding her, and she had difficulty understanding me. Early in the year, there was a short story we read as part of our classwork. And then she gave us a quiz on this short story. She gave me an F on the quiz, or well, the equivalent of a failing grade on the quiz. And I approached her after class and asked her, what I did wrong. And she said I needed to give examples. So later on a test, there were some questions on that test about the essay questions and test about the same short story. And so I elaborated. I did what I thought she wanted me to do, gave examples. Said she marked me off for retelling the story. Well, what was the real problem? I think looking back, and I thought back about this after many years and realized what the real story probably was. And it's she simply didn't understand my answers. They didn't make sense to her. So on the quiz, she concluded that she couldn't see any evidence that I had read the story. So she gave me a failing grade. On the test, she could see that I read the story, but my answers came across as I was just retelling the story. She still didn't understand the conclusions I was giving. That's one thing. When you're in education, you have to sometimes think, okay, what really is the problem here? Is the problem in this case that the child didn't give any examples of what he was saying? Or is it that I don't understand how he came up with these answers? These don't make sense to me. See, and then you can better address it with a child, and the child will understand what you want next time, instead of the child correcting the problem in a way that also is unsatisfactory. Something every parent of a child with autism has to deal with is phobias, unusual phobias that the child has. Often they're generated by fear of something happening again. Like one time they had something happen with the record player. I think another record came down on top of the needle or something, and the record player malfunctioned. After that, I would not use the record player, and I didn't want anybody else to use it either, because I was afraid the same thing would happen. And eventually, after a while, I was willing to let people use the record player, and I was willing to use it again myself, but it took a while. And I think it was one of the first signs to my mom that there was a problem, came up when I was in kindergarten. One day on the way to school, the bus was in a fender bender accident. I say it was a fender bender accident. It wasn't a serious accident. Nobody was hurt. But the bus driver shut us kids up in the bus while he spoke at length with the other driver and with the policeman. And it was being shut up in the bus that scared me, and I cried nonstop. After that, my parents could not get me to get on the school bus for months. I missed most of kindergarten, which back then wasn't a big deal in a way, because kids didn't do anything academic in kindergarten, really. It wasn't like today where kindergarten actually is learning. And back then it was just socializing, finger painting, that sort of thing, singing songs together. But still, the fact is I missed out on a good part of it, because for months I wouldn't get on a school bus. I was afraid that something would happen again and get shut up for a long time on that bus. Tell you about something that led to the most painful medical experience of my life. I wouldn't, for a while, for I think a few years there, when I was a little boy, I would drink only from glasses that had a design on them. I wouldn't drink from any plain glass. Well, at one point, anyway, I was sick. Had a sore throat and running a low-grade fever, and We had a doctor who, I had an uncle who was a doctor. He was in Michigan. We were in New York State, but uh, this doctor that we had, this pediatrician we had gone to medical school with my uncle, and my uncle had helped him with a lot of his work. So he felt kind of a debt of gratitude to the family, and so he made house calls, things that doctors don't do today. And so he came to the house anyway and examined me, took my temperature. Then he put a glass of water on the floor next to the couch where I was laying and asked me to bend down and pick up the glass. Well, I wouldn't bend down and pick it up because it was a plain glass. He thought I couldn't bend down and pick it up. As he was leaving, as he was going out the door, I heard my mom say to him, well, I guess he must have polio. I didn't know what polio was, but okay, it sounded like a kind of a neat name for an ailment. Well, later on that day, that doctor returned with a nurse and some other people, and they put me face down on the dining room table. They started poking my spine with needles. Most painful medical experience I've ever had. I was screaming. They thought fluid would start gushing out. And even when it didn't, they still at first thought I had polio. But then they finally figured out that all I had was tonsillitis. And so he gave me a penicillin shot, and that helped me get over the tonsillitis. But it was all because I wouldn't bend down and pick up that glass. Even mom, even though she was used to, seeing me just drink out of glasses with designs on them, didn't get that was my problem. And my problem, it wasn't a case of couldn't bend down. It was a case of wouldn't bend down. Another one that became an interesting problem in school, particularly when I got into third grade and we had hot lunches. At some point when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I'm not sure exactly at what point, I decided I didn't like to eat with a fork. I didn't like the holes that forks made in food. And so I insisted on eating just with a spoon. Well, of course, I had something like steak, something that needed to be cut up. Mom always cut it up for me. So eating with a spoon didn't really pose a problem. It just, it was a little more awkward. And in school, when I was in first and second grade, we had double sessions, and I went in the afternoon, so we didn't really have an issue with hot lunches. I ate lunch before going to school. When I got to third grade, then it was an all-day school day, and we had hot lunches in the cafeteria, and they gave us whatever utensils were appropriate for the food they served. And so if there wasn't anything that you normally eat with a spoon, then I would eat it with my hands because they didn't give us any spoons. And other kids are saying, eat with a fork, not with your hands. And nobody understood. I had this phobia about eating with a fork. I didn't like the holes they made in food. But with these phobias, the thing is, kids, each of these phobias I suddenly snapped out of at some point. The glass phobia, I suddenly snapped out of that at some point, and I don't remember exactly when. Well, I was in fourth grade when I snapped out of the fork phobia. Then I went in the other direction. I decided spoons were just for babies. And so I started insisting on eating everything with a fork, even ice cream. Even I think I ate applesauce with a fork. I must have made an exception for soup. But, but yeah. And finally, I think I was somewhere in high school when I got over that and started using all silverware the way it's supposed to be used. And again, you have phobias that are based on bad experience. One I had was about food going bad, and some foods I liked, I suddenly stopped eating because I had an incident with, like, they had some sour milk at school, and so then it was a long time before I was willing to drink milk again. I eventually got over that one, but it took a long time. We had one time we're on vacation. We're at my paternal grandmother's house, and we're having cantaloupe with breakfast, and Paul, my brother Paul, who was just a baby then, spit out a piece of cantaloupe, gave him, and then my dad was tasting his, and he said, "This cantaloupe tastes awfully funny." And Mom took a taste and said, "It's no good." After that, it was quite a while before I was willing to eat cantaloupe. I was afraid of cantaloupe being bad. So that's another thing. Another thing, at times I wouldn't wear a particular pair of pants because the pair of pants I'd had an accident in. And it wasn't that I was superstitious, like wearing them was going to cause it to happen again. It was just, I didn't like it, the fact that it reminded me of it. Something I could relate to Raymond and Rain Man on, how he couldn't be persuaded to get on a plane. Well, for a long time when I was growing up, I wouldn't. I was afraid to get on a plane anywhere. Our vacations we took were driving vacations, so it wasn't a problem anyway. We usually went to Michigan, where our relatives were, and drove both ways. And I loved trains. I loved riding trains. Just wouldn't ride a plane. And but it took a while. Mom patiently reasoning with me about the fact that plane travel actually is safer than any other form of travel. You talk about deaths per mile. The reason why you hear so much about plane crashes is they're big news. When a jetliner crashes, it's all over the place. Whereas a car accident, you get a family of 5 killed in a car accident, and it's still only local news. It's not national or world news. When a jetliner crashes, it's broadcast all over the world, and they're talking about it for days afterward. And so it feels as though plane travel were less safe than other forms of travel. And actually, it's the safest form of travel, particularly in terms of deaths per miles traveled, per passenger mile, that is. So it was finally when I was in college, though, in my sophomore year of college, that was when the airlines implemented these youth fares where people between the ages of 13 and 22 could fly for half fare if they flew standby. And so with that, Mom was able to persuade me to get on a plane. I still was terrified, but I got on anyway, knowing that it was saving money, and knowing too that, being conscious that it's really the safest form of travel, even though it felt unsafe. And so again, these are, it's understanding these phobias that kids on the spectrum tend to have. Then there are other things that reflect the differences in people thinking. Sometimes it's getting used to a whole different way of thinking from the way you were brought up to think. My first wife, Judy, and I were planning our wedding, and we were not going to use the traditional wedding marches in our wedding. Well, Judy's parents were all upset about that. And Judy's father said like he didn't feel that it was a valid wedding without those marches. And I couldn't believe that he was serious when he said that. Because my way of thinking was, what about all the couples that were married throughout human existence before Wagner and Mendelssohn were even born? Were their marriages invalid? Were all the children born to their marriages illegitimate? But it wasn't until many years later that my daughter explained their way of thinking to me, that they, from their background, because of their background, they had this need for things to be quote unquote normal. And this violated their sense of normalcy, not to use the traditional wedding marches in a wedding. And so it's sometimes that's the thing too for us is understanding people who think in ways that we weren't raised to think. On the other hand, do people on the autism spectrum always think differently from neurotypicals? Not always. Here's an interesting one. When I was in third grade, well, first I got to preface this. My mom's favorite expression of frustration was, I'm not going to repeat the words she used, but she is bleep, bleep, and corruption. The bleeps were the dirty words for the two toilet functions. Okay, so you hear his imagination. This is an exclamation mom used when she was frustrated. Well, when I was in third grade, I was given this scholastic achievement test. And here I get to this question. The carcass of a dead animal, it's multiple choice questions, okay? The carcass of a dead, the body of a dead animal. I'm giving away the answer in the way I'm wording it. The body of a dead animal is called a carcass. Of course, we know that's the right answer. B, corpse. C, corpuscle. Or D, corruption. Well, after I got over my shock over seeing something that I had just assumed was a dirty word, when mom used that expression, I didn't know what corruption was, but I assumed it must be something gross, and I assumed it was a dirty word too. After I got over my shock at seeing what I had assumed was a dirty word in a question and a test meant for children, I decided, well, the body of a dead animal is pretty gross, so that must be what a corruption is, and so I chose answer D. Well, it wasn't until decades later, and by this time this was just over 40 years later. Mom and dad and I were all visiting my sister, and my sister and I got to talking. This was when I was on my way to getting diagnosed, by the way. This is when I, by then, suspected I had autism, but hadn't been formally diagnosed yet. And my sister and I were talking, and we talked about that question, and it turned out she was given the same test 3 years later. She was 3 years younger than I was, and she had the same shocked reaction and came to the same conclusion and gave the same wrong answer that I did. So Jenny Jenny was clearly neurotypical. One issue when I was growing up was that Jenny had a very easy time making friends, and she was very well liked, had lots of friends. I was very jealous of her because she had all those friends. And so Jenny was clearly neurotypical, but here she and I followed the same logic on that question. So she and I both confronted mom with that, about how she had caused us both to get that question wrong. Something else with us is generalization. We can understand that something has a more general meaning than the specific meaning we read, but we can have trouble thinking of other situations to which it applies until we start hearing some other situations. Here's an example of when I was in 5th grade, and I was several years ahead of the other kids in math. And so about halfway through the school year, the school principal approached me in the lunchroom and gave me this geometry problem and asked me if I could solve it, and I couldn't. And so then he invited me to come to his office a half hour before the school day ended each day, and he would teach me geometry. And so he did. I don't know if they still teach geometry the way they did then, but back then a geometry class doubled as a class in logic. And I remember the book giving several examples of flawed reasoning. Well, now, if you ask me for an example of flawed reasoning, for years after that, I only could have quoted one of those examples in the book. Now, I had to hear other things that I could identify as faulty reasoning before I finally got the general concept. And I could identify faulty reasoning when I heard it. Or another example was in my family. Okay, we were discussing reproduction, and the fact came up that kids don't reach the ability to reproduce until a certain age, and Dad added that if my sister Jenny gave birth to a baby, there would be a scandal. I asked, what's a scandal? And he said, well, that's when everybody kind of talks about something. And I couldn't get the concept. So I could only think of scandal in terms of an underage girl giving birth to a baby. And I had to, again, hear the term used in other ways. When I was 13, two major scandals helped me expand my understanding of the term. One was the payola scandal involving the TV show The Big Beat, and another was the scandal involving the quiz show involving Charles Van Doren, who was fed the answers in the quiz show, and everybody thought he was a genius, and turned out the whole thing was staged. And then later had the John Profumo scandal in Great Britain, which involved sex, but it didn't involve underage girls. Then the Watergate scandal and so forth. But I had to hear some examples of the word used to refer to other things before I finally could identify, okay, this is an example of a scandal. Anyway, I hope what I've said, helps the parents here to have some insight into the way your child thinks, and I'm ready to entertain questions. I hope I've been helpful to some people here. Okay, apparently I got dropped from the show somehow when I was checking on the messages. Okay, how old was I when I was officially diagnosed with autism? I was 49. I'll tell you what led to my diagnosis. Actually, my daughter was the first one to suspect that I might have autism. But I never even learned about autism. I never even heard about it till I was in my 30s, and my late first wife Judy told me there was a show on TV she wanted to watch. It's about a program in school for teaching autistic kids, and I'd never heard the term autistic before. So I watched it with her, and they show these kids, like this girl spinning the wheels on something forever, and show these kids who are doing things like that, or the girl was spinning a top forever, a boy was spinning wheels in his truck forever, and I couldn't relate to that. But later on, then in 1995, I read an article in Awake magazine, Autism, and there was a box in there of special abilities, and it mentioned that some have special abilities in math and music, and some things there in the box part about math, and also some of the other things. I wondered, is there a milder form of this? Because obviously I didn't fit the description of the severe, disabilities that were described, but maybe there might be a milder form I had. Well, then I kind of forgot about it. Then that December, I was turning on the TV, and the movie Rain Man was coming on. Well, my daughter had been urging me to watch that movie, which I hadn't watched, and so, okay, let me see it. And as I watched it through, I could relate to Raymond. I could relate to a lot of things. I could say I'm a less severe form of Raymond. For example, he could do these long multiplications in his head. Well, I can multiply 3-digit numbers in my head. I can't. Give me a couple of 7-digit numbers, forget it. I'm not going to be able to do that. But I mean, 3-digit numbers, I'll do them in my head. But he couldn't do a simple problem involving applying math. You start out with $1 and you spend 50 cents. How much do you have left? He couldn't do that. I saw the way he reacted to a catchy tune, a catchy advertising slogan he heard on the radio. He had to start repeating that, and drove his brother up a wall till his brother told him, and his brother made him stop. That was something I could relate to, my reaction to catchy tunes or catchy slogans. And there are other things, even the phobia about flying, although I couldn't recite the exact numbers of people killed in crashes. I still was aware that plane crashes made big news. And, I had at one time been scared of flying. And so then, after watching the movie, I said, let me look up autism in the Mayo Clinic Family Medical Guide. And the last 2 sentences mentioned there is a milder form of autism whose main symptom is social awkwardness. And that, bingo. Well, then in subsequent conversations, I mentioned to my mom and I mentioned to my sister my suspicions. And I started out, and I talked to my mom. I said, this is going to sound crazy, but, and after I told her, she said, it doesn't sound crazy at all to me. I think you're onto something. And my sister, very similar reaction. And I was wondering, but I still didn't know. But then during that visit to my sister, when we were in Arkansas, one afternoon, I turned on the radio in my rental car, and okay, what made me interested in religion? I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, but I was listening to the radio in my rental car, and an interview of Temple Grandin came on. They were interviewing her about her book, Thinking in Pictures. And so I went out and bought the book, read it through, Now I understood the terminology, which has changed considerably since her book came out. But the terminology at the time, then I called the local chapter of the Autism Society of America, and the president referred me to a neurologist who was able to diagnose me. So that's how I got diagnosed. What made me interested in religion? This is kind of a long story. I grew up in a family that was, I guess I call semi-religious. My dad was an atheist. My mom, when I was 9 years old or 8 going on 9, she started attending an Episcopal church. And Jenny and I attended off and on with her. Well, Jenny attended pretty regularly with her. I was off and on. I would attend for a while and I would stop for a while, go for a while and stop for a while. When I stopped, I would be home with my dad, who would spend Sunday morning teaching me philosophy. So that's how I got started. I had some other exposure to religion too. My dad had a dislike for religion. My mom listened to WQXR, the world famous classical music station, on Fridays, particularly during the fall and winter months when we were not on daylight savings time and when sundown came early. Often before Dad got home, that station would broadcast Sabbath services from Temple Beth El in New York, and I would listen to them, and I didn't really understand the difference between Judaism and the religion that I was later exposed to, the Episcopal Church. Eventually, I would come to understand that, but anyway, that was my early exposure, and finally, I kind of got turned off on religion. Then I got to thinking there's got to be a higher power. There has to be a prime mover, something. And then I began reading the New Testament, the Psalms and Proverbs that I had been issued when I joined the Naval Reserves. And I started reading the Gospel of Matthew, and that had the ring of truth. And I started going to a church, and it was that summer that Jehovah's Witnesses came to our house. And my mom had discussions with them before, just being nice. She wasn't really interested, but she was being nice. And so I sat down with them and I started raising objections because I'd been taught at home and at school that evolution was a fact. In college, though, I learned that there was one professor there, a natural science professor, who had rejected the theory of evolution. So I was a little more open-minded about it than I would have been 2 years earlier. But that was my main objection. And eventually, I came to see that the Bible is a whole and that you can't really accept one part without accepting the rest. And I came to see the reasonableness of the Bible's explanation of how a man's creation. And anyway, that's where I got going on my Bible study and coming to meetings. And I was baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in November of 1967. So, that's my story anyway, Steve. So let's see, any other questions that anyone has here? Let me just check the chat, and I hope I can check it without losing the video here. Let me just go and check it and see and make sure I can check it without losing the video. Just a minute. I'm going to see. Last time I lost the video. Okay, Lorianne asked if I always keep on thinking, and can that affect sleeping? Yeah, it can. What I do, though, the way I get to sleep is I do math problems in my head, and that helps me to actually get to sleep. And it's funny, one thing, when I was between when I was 5 and I was 9, I filled up reams of paper counting by 76s. And I could look at a number even now and tell you, and on sight, whether it's a multiple of 76. I can tell you from memory that 76 to the 12th power is, get this, 37 sextillion, 133 quintillion, 262 quadrillion, 473 trillion, 195 billion, 501 million, 387,776. So that gives you an idea of yeah, I'll do math problems to help me get to sleep. Okay, when I was a kid, did I think I was different than the other kids in any ways? Yeah, in fact, even as an adult, I knew that my way of thinking was different from others, but I couldn't put a label on it. And as a kid, that, I mentioned the child psychiatrist that mom took me to when I was 6. And then there were 2 other mental health professionals she took me to in subsequent years, and they all found different ways to blame mom for my problems. The child psychiatrist, he had the biggest missed opportunity to figure out something, and it's the difference between the Galileos and the Isaac Newtons of the world and the run-of-the-mill scientists, the ones who are willing to think outside the box, follow the facts wherever they may lead. And he wasn't. He read the first paragraph of the letter mom wrote him, in which she had detailed all the different unusual things she'd noticed about me. But he read just that first paragraph, where she talked about the problem that immediately, the immediate problem at hand, the letter take me to him, and said it's all mom's fault. She was obsessed with toilet training. That's the thing. I knew all along there was something different about the way I thought. And of course, the fact that I was ahead of other kids in math, that was part of it. Now, do your things have a special meaning in ordering? Do you mean like, do things have to be in a special order? Can you clarify that a little bit, Orianda? Is that what you mean? Do things have to be in a special order? That's something that through the years I've gotten away from. But as a child, often there were certain things in the way, the order things had to be in, order I had to do certain things in. I've gradually gotten away from that. So, learn to be more flexible about things. If that's what you're saying, if that's not what you're saying, maybe you can clarify it, and then I can answer it better. Okay, so that's what you meant. Yeah. Okay. Even now, I tend to have routines about certain things. Like, I vary my breakfast, for example, as to what I have, but I still tend to do some things in a certain order. Like I'll drink my juice first, then I'll sip my coffee as I'm eating the food portion of my breakfast. And usually I have either eggs and some meat item and toast, or I'll have cereal with milk and and bananas. And as Brandon knows, when his movies are out of his order, that sounds like something I would have as a kid. And I'll give you an example too of something from when I was a kid. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But yeah, I'll then by the time I'm halfway through the breakfast, I've finished my first cup of coffee. So then I'll take my vitamin pills that I take in the morning, and I'll take them with half of my glass of water. And I'll pour my second cup of coffee, and I'll eat the rest of my breakfast with the second. Well, I sip the second cup of coffee in between, and when I finish, I'll drink up the rest of the water. That's kind of a routine I follow. But yeah, the thing with things having to be in a certain order, or I remember, my parents taught me to play bridge. I would insist putting the suits in the dummy a certain order. I understood the trump suit was supposed to be on the left, but the others I would arrange in order of ranking, even if it meant, not alternating colors. And so, I had certain things that in my way of thinking had to be in a certain order. Oop. I knocked myself out of the broadcast studio again, but I'm back in. So, okay, I'll take further questions. I'm trying to think of a few other anecdotes that perhaps also I can share here. But yeah, I always knew that there was some difference from the way that I reason on things and the way other people do. And to me, something has one meaning. To somebody else, there's a side issue that it raises. It's a meaning I didn't mean to raise, and that's something, of course, I've had to learn over the years, and had to learn how to avoid raising side issues in people's minds, and how to avoid saying something that's going to be interpreted a way I didn't mean for it to be interpreted. And I'll say too that as she was growing up, my daughter recognized that there was something different about me from most people. And she and I were always very close and continue to be very close. And anybody seen the pictures of us can see that. Okay, my nonverbal 10-year-old grandson is devastated because he has a routine that has been broken due to the virus. He's having tantra, and I'm not used to it. He thoughts, yeah, I know it's a complete change in routine. And when you have and that's the thing, I think if it had been me in that situation, because I'm, what we now call level 1 autistic, level 1 autism, I think my parents could have explained things to me pretty well and I would have understood. But to a child who has limited comprehension of the world around him, who has difficulty comprehending things, the routine can be everything. And they're, the only thing I can say is and talking with children on the spectrum, and as a parent, you know best your child's ability to understand things. You can explain, as simply as possible, there's a very bad sickness going around, and that it's, and that they, to keep more people from getting sick, they have to keep people away from each other as much as possible. The more you stay away from other people, the less chance you have of getting it. Is it really true that when a person's autism is stemming, that means they're happy? It might mean that, might mean they're tense, might just be something we do. I mean, I twitch. At times it's not necessarily a case of being happy or unhappy. It's just what I do. Um, I don't know if it's necessarily associated with being happy or unhappy. Oh, I gotta tell you something. This is from when I was a kid. Again, it illustrates about keeping things simple. I remember I'd read about a card game called poker. I asked my mom about it, and she gave this explanation that made it sound hideously complicated game. Well, then, not long after that, my dad taught me how to play poker. My dad just presented it simply to me. Didn't go into all this business about people betting money and so on. I mean, that came in gradually, but the first thing was just teaching the ranking of different hands. This is what you're trying to get, and so just illustrating, keep it simple when you're explaining things to the kids with autism. And again, though, not all kids, depending on where they are on the spectrum, are able to comprehend everything, and that can be a big problem in this virus pandemic. Okay. Well, thank everyone for being here. I hope I've been helpful to everyone. I think I can conclude this now if there are no further questions. And hope I can be helpful to others, either, when we have our live on Sundays or future focus lives. Pandemic has been trying on the ADD children. I've had conversations with other parents. Yeah, for children with, different ways of thinking, it can be difficult. With ADD, it's interesting. I have a stepdaughter who I think may have ADD. I observed some things about her over the years, the difficulty in staying focused on one thing. And it's interesting. And of course, she and I, again, have been close for decades, from when she was a little girl before, I knew that we knew that she would ever be my stepdaughter. But so, so I've had some experience with that too. Well, enjoyed doing this, and it's my pleasure to help others out wherever possible. Yeah. Good night, everyone.